Hello, and welcome back to the next session of Penny's podcasts. And in this session, we will be talking about extremes of intelligence. We're going to be comparing really the people on one extreme of intelligence to the people like on the higher extreme of intelligence to the people on the lower extreme of intelligence. Understanding this, that intelligence, again, is a construct. It's not a physical entity. It's not something that actually exists. So this is really dependent upon what definition you accept for intelligence. And the reason really for looking at extremes like this is that one way you might test for validity is to compare people that perform, on one extreme or the other. So if you take, for example, just a standard test, I would expect a person who gets an A on an exam to know more than somebody who failed. And really up until the DSM-5, the major way of diagnosing somebody with an intellectual disability, which is what it's now called, or recognizing giftedness was really based on IQ scores. But I want to remind you with IQ scores, and we'll look at that normal distribution again, which we looked at in the research methods section, right? So the average IQ score is here, right, at 100, with 68% of the population falling between an 85 and 115. With that standard deviation of 15, if I go out another 15 in this direction, I have 130. If I go out another 15 in that direction, I get to 70. So 95% of the population will really have an IQ between 70 and 130. Now, as I tell you that this type of test, an IQ test, was often used to identify, people with intellectual disabilities or people with giftedness, I want you to remember that the IQ test itself is not actually intended to measure these extremes over here. It's intended, actually these extremes here, right? It's intended to measure the average. So what we find on the upper ends here, on the extremes, is that one or two questions can alter somebody's score quite a bit. So it's weird to say like, oh, if you have a 188 IQ, that would be an odd statement to make. Really, because IQ tests aren't really designed to test that high, we would call you in the untestably high range. In the same way, or in a similar way, really, when we get to the lower end, IQ tests are not really meant to test that. So one or two questions can alter a score quite a bit at the extremes, and you'll get to the area where it wouldn't even make sense to give somebody an IQ test. They wouldn't be able to do some of the more basic questions, depending on really the severity of the disability. Before we go on to looking at the extremes of intelligence, I want to focus for a second on this area here. So between that 70 and 85, really, I guess it would be 71 to 84. In the DSM-4, this was defined as borderline intellectual functioning. And, I work in a school, so I tend to think of things in terms of like school settings. And what's interesting is that if people fall in the zone here, they're going to struggle in class. They're going to have a harder time with math and reading tasks. They're going to have a harder time understanding assignments. Assignments that seem easier to a lot of other people will be a lot more difficult to people in this IQ range. But the truth of it is that somebody in this zone may or may not actually qualify for special education services. So to clarify some misunderstandings that I've come across, this 70 and below mark would be like that intellectual disability category. And there's less focus on the IQ scores now, but it's important to kind of put it all together this way. And when I say 71 to 84, that's that borderline intellectual functioning range. I also want you to note that I am not talking about people with learning disabilities. Learning disabilities are entirely different. Somebody with a learning disability has an IQ score that's either in the average range or above average range, but they struggle in one of three major areas. So there's a deficit either in reading, writing, or math. So somebody could be, if they have a reading disability, we might say that that they have dyslexia. If they have a writing disability, we might say that they have dysgraphia. And if they have a learning disability in math, we would say that they have dyscalculia. But I want you to note that there's no IQ deficit in a learning disability. It's really just your IQ is, like I said, average to above average, just deficit in one area. So if you have a learning disability, you may qualify for special education services. If you have an intellectual disability, you will qualify for special education services. If you have borderline intellectual functioning, you're going to be struggling in school, but you may or may not actually qualify for special education services. That would depend on a number of other factors, including like whether or not you have another diagnosis and what that is. You would, however, qualify regardless for a 504 plan. So I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with what a 504 plan is. So if somebody is getting special education services, that's really under IDEA, and they would be entitled to a modified and accommodated plan. So we could change what you learn and how you go about learning it, right? And also level the playing field to the extent possible. If you get a 504, that's from the Americans with Disability Act. This is an anti-discrimination act, so it's an unfunded federal mandate that would allow somebody to get accommodations. These accommodations are really meant to level the playing field. So I might give you an accommodation of extended time, let's say, or you might get an accommodation of extended time. So long as I'm not testing you on how fast it takes you to do something, then it's an accommodation. If I am testing you on how fast it would take you to do math facts, let's say, then changing the amount of time you're allotted would be a modification. So you wouldn't be allowed modifications in this zone unless you were somehow classified under IDEA. That's not a for the AP sort of information. It's just something I think that's useful to know. From my perspective, I'm always thinking like, okay, like if 20% of the population has learning disabilities, are we reaching everybody with a learning disability? And then that obviously it's going to be a smaller subset that has borderline intellectual functioning, but the question is always like, are we meeting their needs? Are we doing everything we can to meet their needs in the classroom? Are we setting appropriate expectations? And as you learned, the intelligence testing movement took a really nasty turn, right? Really fed into the eugenics movement. It's horrible. When Simon and Binet were coming up with this, their idea was to help struggling learners, identify people who are going to struggle, compare them to people who were not, see what you could do to close the gaps. And that's really the way in which I want you to look at this, not a support. This is not me throwing my support behind IQ scores and using this as a measure. So a little history here. If you were to go into this more historically, you'll want to know that the name I'm referring to, people with an IQ essentially of 70 or below, and I'll define it in another way, are referred to as having an intellectual disability. But this name, what people in this category have been called, has changed over time. And you will note that most of these words, as you see them now, will be seen as pejoratives, as put-downs, like an idiot, moron, feeble-minded, mentally retarded. So, and in this category, so when I was in school, this is the category for people with intellectual disabilities. They were called mentally retarded. And you've heard people use the word retarded as a pejorative. So really ask you not to do that. But this was broken down further into other categories as educable, trainable, and then severe and profound. I don't think they had another name for that. And we've moved on to intellectual disability. These words keep changing as the identifiers have been really used as put-downs. This change in names, and I've obviously excluded some, like imbecile is another one that was used. But this name, Rosa's Law, this change from calling it mental retardation to intellectual disability, this came really from the work of this girl, Rosa. I don't actually remember her last name, but she was a 9-year-old girl with Down syndrome who worked together with her family to have the words mental retardation removed from like health and education code in the state of Maryland. Ultimately, this will become a law that will go to the United States Senate, it will go to the House of Representatives, and will be signed into law by President Barack Obama. When we look at intellectual disabilities, you'll notice a few things in common. So if a person has an intellectual disability, they will have deficits in general mental abilities, the ability to do the reasoning tasks and understanding type of tasks that school would typically require. There would also be an impairment in adaptive functioning. So this is a person's really ability to effectively interact with society, to care for oneself, that sort of thing. This would be you would have an onset before the ending of the developmental period, which nowadays is really considered birth until 22 years, although you're more likely to see it way before 22 years. Just that you could also see a later onset depending on the disorder itself. And you'll note that people are more or less affected by it. And if you think of a bell curve and how things are normally distributed, most people with intellectual disabilities will really fall in this mild category. This push has been like this movement away from IQ scores and focusing entirely on adaptive ability. In general, though, we're going to notice that the DSM-5, which is the current DSM, the focus is really away from IQs, that IQ mark of 70 or less. But they would have trouble with ADLs, and that stands for activities of daily living. So being able to live independently and on their own, bathe, say, order food, do grocery shopping, that sort of thing. They would have difficulty understanding speech and expressing their thoughts and feelings through speech. They would have difficulty understanding social cues, difficulty with learning and concentrating. They often act younger than their age and will have difficulty with reading and writing. The former classifications, I'm just putting it there so you kind of have a sense of how it works in terms of the bell curve, but not that this is the way it's broken down anymore. When people were only mildly affected, they would have this IQ between 50 and 70. So they were usually able to become self-sufficient. They might marry, have a family, hold a job. Their job would likely require unskilled labor. A moderate intellectual disability, or what was formerly called moderate mental retardation, would be an IQ between 35 and 49. They would be able to perform simple, unskilled tasks. They can contribute to a certain extent of their livelihood, but they would be unlikely to ever live independently. I do remember, back in my teens and 20s, going to ice cream places where everybody working there had an intellectual disability. They were supported a lot, but they had intellectual disabilities. And I always wanted to support a business who was helping the disabled community in any way, but certainly have gone to other places too, like restaurants or fast food places or like a department store or something where you'll see people with intellectual disabilities doing great work, working hard, having a very fulfilling job and career, and able to make money and sustain some level of independence. When you look really towards the severe, you're getting untestably low here. So an IQ of 20 to 34, you're able to follow daily routines with constant supervision. With training, you might learn some basic communication skills, and below that, if you're profoundly affected, you would have an IQ below 20. So it's untestably low, and nobody's going to sit you down for an IQ test at this level. I remember my parents having friends who had a child, I believe, with a trisomy 16. I don't remember if it was full or partial because one always ends up in a miscarriage, usually within the first trimester, and usually after a very low heartbeat, and the other one more likely to have the child, but then the child will be profoundly affected. And so I remember my parents having a friend who had a child who was profoundly intellectually disabled, and I was confused as a child, sort of watching the things that she wasn't able to do. And I kind of remember learning, and I think my parents must have sort of helped me with this, because I'm not sure how I learned this, but I remember learning at this point that it wasn't for me to feel bad for somebody because maybe they couldn't do what I could do, because there was no sign that this child was in any way unhappy. So it was like my expectations for my life. It was not fair to put them on them. They seemed to be doing well within their own expectations. As we go through some of the most common causes of intellectual disabilities, I want you to again remember that really fewer than 3% of the population has an intellectual disability, and 85% of those people with intellectual disabilities are only mildly affected. So you're very unlikely to see the limitations really outside of an academic setting. So first up, we have Down syndrome. Down syndrome is a genetic cause of an intellectual disability, and it results from a trisomy, an extra chromosome, either full or part. So where we're supposed to have 2 copies of each chromosome, in a trisomy, you have a partial triploid or a full triploid, so a third copy of something. And so in Down syndrome, you have a partial or complete copy of the 21st chromosome, which results in some physical things that you might notice, and also an intellectual disability. Again, most people with Down syndrome would be only mildly affected. You'll find that Down syndrome is often recognizable. So it's characterized by this flat-looking facial feature, this weak muscle tone or hypotonia. So here are two pictures of people with Down syndrome. Some of the noticeable features that you might see with somebody with Down syndrome would be that they have, shorter fingers. Their fifth finger or their pinky finger tends to curve inward. Their hair tends to be thin and straight, and their stature tends to be on the shorter side. When you look at the face, you'll notice really these like slight slanting of the eyes, their eyes almost look almondy shaped. You'll see small chins, these rounder faces, flat nasal bridges. Sometimes you'll see abnormalities with their ears and like a flatter nose. Basically, Down syndrome is rather recognizable. And I know years ago, I don't know if this is still a thing, but there was this big sort of controversy over people getting plastic surgery to kind of hide the fact that somebody had Down syndrome. This is upsetting on so many levels, and I'm not going to say that I'm judging the person with Down syndrome for getting it, or the parents for deciding to do this, the family, what they're going through. I think it's more of a societal thing that they would be so discriminated against that they would feel that they needed to do this in order to fit in. I think that's the part that breaks my heart. I don't know if this is still a controversy in this area, but it certainly was when I was growing up. And it's hard to think about the fact that there are so many jobs that somebody with intellectual disability can do so well and be so great at and so well suited for and be so happy to do, that somebody might discriminate against them because of the way that they look. I can't even, it's so upsetting. Next up, we have Fragile X syndrome. This is an abnormality of the X chromosome caused by a defective gene. So this one is hereditary and genetic, but you're most likely to see Fragile X syndrome in males because males have only one X chromosome, where females have two. This is the most common inherited form of an intellectual disability. So this disorder will affect a person's development. It'll affect a person's behavior and ability to learn. It can affect their ability to communicate. It will affect, in some cases, their physical appearance, sensitivity to noise, which we call that hyperacusis, sensitivity to light, or issues with other sensory information. And because it's on the X chromosome, it means that anyone with this FMR1 gene mutation can pass it along to their children. However, a person who inherits a gene mutation may not develop Fragile X syndrome. Males will pass it down to all of their daughters, and not their sons. Females have a 50-50 chance to pass it along to both their sons and daughters. And like I said, because females have two X chromosomes and males have an XY, you're more likely to see Fragile X be more mild in female cases. When looking at the physical features, and you'll notice that in both cases this is child to adult, you'll see that the head size tends to be on the larger side. The face tends to look long. They have prominent foreheads and chins, and they tend to have protruding ears. Next, we have phenylketonuria. This is often called PKU. This is a metabolic disorder resulting from an enzyme deficiency. So essentially, it's a rare inherited disorder that will cause an amino acid called phenylalanine to build up in the body. It's caused by a defect in the gene that helps to create the enzyme needed to break down phenylalanine. This wouldn't have been tested on people my age because people weren't aware of it that long ago. So now it's tested through a blood test, and it must be controlled through the diet. If you have this buildup in your system, it causes a lot of problems. The buildup of high phenylalanine would cause somebody to become intellectually disabled. So the bottom line is you cannot let a child eat food or drink drinks that have certain things in them, because they will not be able to process it, and it will cause deficits in their intellectual disabilities that will increase through time. They're going to get worse if they keep eating the wrong foods. While this is a rare condition, I have met several people with PKU before, and in some cases, you'll see that somebody, if they don't tell you that they have PKU, you wouldn't know. There's no physical feature that you're looking at for sure. But if they eat the wrong foods, they will become more and more intellectually disabled. So I've kind of seen the spectrum on this one, where it's, they didn't tell you, you'd never know, and they have been affected because of eating the wrong foods. And I know that it was a thing that it's like, just don't eat the wrong foods in your developmental years, so which we'd consider to 18, now to 22. I think that most of people recognize right now, while it's more dangerous to eat it while you're younger because you're developing more, it's a lifelong diet that you're on, essentially. So one thing a parent with a child with PKU will want to pay attention to, and obviously the child as they get older will want to pay attention to, are what foods have high phenylalanine content in them and which foods have low phenylalanine contents in them. And essentially when you look at their food, and sometimes it's prescription food, depending on how severe the deficiency is, but you'll have green light foods that you can eat as much as you like, yellow light foods where you're looking to have kind of a balanced diet, but you have to eat them in small measured amounts, and then you have red light foods where you just can't go near it. It's not safe. And so these would be examples of high phenylalanine foods. So like fish, diet soda that has aspartame in it, it's horrible. Wheat, meat, milk, just dairy, nuts, eggs. These are your higher protein foods. They're going to have higher phenylalanine in them. On the lower end, you have most vegetables, fruits, sugars. So there's certainly plenty that can be eaten, but you can see how it's harder to get a balanced diet when you have to avoid high phenylalanine foods. Fetal alcohol syndrome is another intellectual disability, but this one is 100% preventable. This is entirely caused by a pregnant woman's drinking, often heavy drinking during pregnancy. Alcohol is an example of a teratogen, and that's a word you're going to want to know. Really, teratogens are anything that can get past the placental barrier and harm an unborn child. So alcohol, chemicals, some prescription and over-the-counter medications, drugs, radiation, viruses, those are all examples of teratogens. So alcohol is a teratogen, and if a pregnant woman drinks, it can harm the unborn child. So one of the things is that obviously the risk with drinking is greater at the beginning of pregnancy and in the first trimester, because when a child is developing, they develop really from inside out, like so major organs before fingers and toes, that sort of thing, and they develop top to bottom. So major organs like the brain are going to develop first. So as soon as somebody suspects that they might be pregnant, or that they're trying to be pregnant, or they think they could be pregnant, or whatever it is, they should refrain from drinking. We don't actually know how much alcohol it takes to cause this problem either. But the question always remains is that, is somebody as healthy as they could have been had you not been drinking? And honestly, I also recognize that some people don't know that they are pregnant. They have no idea, and may have been drinking or get horrified. They're like, oh my God, I'm pregnant, I didn't know, and I was drinking for whatever period of time. Okay, so stop. As soon as you find out that you are pregnant, stop. So you'll also notice that with cases of fetal alcohol syndrome, there are some features that are recognizable. And these are both the pictures of brains at the same part of development, so at the same age. And you'll notice one is smaller and you see less distinctions between the hemisphere. But obviously this is going to be brain damage that's resulting from heavy prenatal alcohol drinking. And you'll notice other sort of issues here. So on the social and cognitive deficits, poor wake-sleep patterns, they might be immature, poor judgment, irritable, poor social skills, problem then once again with ADLs, your activities of daily living. On the cognitive side, you'll see ADD or ADHD. I'll explain that one at another point. I feel like you probably have a good sense of what that is, but I'll explain it. poor memory, learning disabilities, or a low IQ. Remember, you can't have both of those things at the same time. Poor coordination, and speech and language delays. When you look at the facial features, you'll notice a few things that I'll point you to here. One is the epicanthal folding right over here. You will also see this flat midface, this very thin upper lip. You'll see the shorter chin, a shorter nose. You will also see an indistinct philtrum. So this area right here that I think some people affectionately call the booger gutter, you will see that kind of smoothed over. Minor abnormalities with the ears, low nasal bridge that has a tendency to make the eyes look a little wide set. It's just because the nasal bridge is lower. I also want to point out that if you had any one of these issues, anything on the previous slide with social and cognitive stuff, or any of the facial features, like you're like, oh, I don't have a distinct philtrum, or I have a flattened face or thin upper lip, that by itself doesn't mean anything. It's a collection of items, so don't worry. And once again, I want to remind you that that's on the lower end of the IQ spectrum. But with these disorders, it depends on the severity. Most people with intellectual disabilities will be only mildly affected. In some cases, somebody with PKU or Fragile X or fetal alcohol syndrome may have other cognitive or social deficits, but may not have a full intellectual disability. So that's when we go back to that borderline intellectual functioning zone. It's when I said, if you're getting special ed services, it kind of depends on some other factors, and some of these things that I mentioned would be among the other factors. Now, to look at the other end of the spectrum, so again, when we're looking at IQ tests, we're looking to discover averages, not really the extremes all that much, but most people would mark giftedness as being, 130 or higher. Some gifted programs will put it like, oh, you're mildly gifted at 115 or over, or some will mark it at 120. But as you move to the extremes, you have to also wonder, or at least I do, how we are effectively reaching you in school as well. Obviously, people that are looking at deficits in learning are going, we're going to look to take care of them. But we want to take care of people at both ends of the spectrum. So giftedness falls really under the umbrella of special education as well, although you wouldn't get an IEP for being gifted. It wouldn't work that way. But personally, I fear that sometimes the kids on the gifted end of the spectrum, and I don't want to focus it all on IQs, right? But I do feel that maybe sometimes we aren't always, just education in general, we aren't always meeting their needs either, because you get that classic kind of gifted underachiever, that kid who can show up to school, they basically do their work, but they don't really know how to study. They don't have to work that hard for anything. Everything just comes sort of naturally. And then they don't really develop the skills they need, that work ethic that they need to really push that. And so sometimes they hit a wall. Often that wall could be like chemistry. Chemistry is a hard class for a lot of people. Maybe physics. A lot of times in the math and science, but it could come wherever. And you'll find that they don't have the skills that other people have spent years developing, these study skills, these work ethic skills. And so it is something that you want to pay attention to early on to make sure that you want everybody to be appropriately challenged, all people to have stuff that they can, feel good about doing, and also that causes them to reach a little bit. Ideally, in education, we want to see everyone's best work. So you'll notice with something like savant syndrome, which is this exceptional skill or brilliance in some limited field. First, I want you to hear that if I say that somebody has savant syndrome, you're basically saying that they're exceptional, amazing, really, in this one particular area, or like a couple particular areas, but they also have a deficit in other areas as well. While savant syndrome is rare, you do see it paired up with certain developmental disabilities more than others. So it's not, I shouldn't say it's rare, but I'm going to say I've seen it paired with autism not infrequently. And I want you to notice that I did not have autism on the list of intellectual disabilities when we were talking about that, because there is no intellectual disability with autism. That's a problem with communication, social skills, or behavior, but not with intelligence. So somebody with savant syndrome might be incredible at like music, or they might have an incredible memory for details of whatever it is, remembering stats or what have you. there are actually some people, or there have been some people who are considered mega savants, which is extraordinarily rare, where you have, a serious mental disorder, but you also have incredible savant ability in many areas. And if you're interested in that sort of thing, you might want to look up somebody by the name of Kim Peek. There's some videos of him. He's a mega savant. Unbelievable what he'd be able to do. I think you'd find it fascinating. The movie Rain Man, where you had Dustin Hoffman playing an autistic person with a savant ability, with savant syndrome, was modeled after Kim Peek. Although Kim Peek did not have autism, he did have other developmental conditions. But then we look at mental giftedness, so you're testing, if you think of like Spearman's G, you're testing rather strongly in all areas, right? These are people with such exceptionally high IQs that they are in the top 1% to 2% of the population typically. You may note that there is a tendency to also kind of throw pejoratives at this group of people, and people find it acceptable. I'm not saying that I do, I'm just saying that people don't seem to take offense when you call somebody like a nerd or you're such a geek or whatever it is. And there's that like stereotypical like, oh yeah, you're book smart, but you have no common sense, or you can't do sports, or fill in the blank. So years ago, Lewis Terman, and you might remember his name from the intelligence testing movement. He was the one who made the Stanford Binet. Remember Stanford because he was working out of Stanford University, and Binet because he was basing it off of Simon and Binet's intelligence test that they were using in Paris. He did a longitudinal study, which means that he's taking the same group of people and studying them over the course of many years. What he had done was he was trying to address some of the stereotypes and the pejoratives associated with gifted people. So he used teacher recommendations and IQ tests to identify 1,500 gifted children, and he marked the gifted mark as 140 or higher, and he tracked their progress through adulthood. And the result was that he destroyed many of the myths and stereotypes about gifted children, that they're like nerdy or they have no social skills or what have you, that they received excellent grades, they were taller, stronger, more socially well-adjusted than their peers with average IQs. I'm not going to pretend that this study is flawless here, but we'll talk about that at another point. But many of them went on to be successful in their careers. Some members, though, were not successful and were like their, as Terman would have put it, their less intelligent peers in many ways, like maybe alcoholics or divorced, that sort of thing. But a few things here. One is the bottom line is intelligence is not a guarantee. And this is you have to accept Terman's idea of intelligence, which we saw is fraught with problems. Not a guarantee of success in every endeavor. It just means that you'll probably have more intellectual opportunities. Also understand that this relationship that he was discovering was really more of a correlation, because there was also this self-fulfilling prophecy, because the people in the study knew they were in the study and they knew that they were gifted. In fact, they referred to themselves as Terman's termites, affectionately. But these longitudinal studies are used to track the same group of people over a lifespan. And therefore, the differences observed in these people are less likely to be the result of cultural differences across generations. A more practical way, to do a study over generations would be to do a cross-sectional study, which is a bit different, so that you're observing some subset of the population at the same time. So you're comparing, say, groups of 5-year-olds to 10 to 15 to 20 and so on many independent variables, whatever you decide, your IQ, memory, whatever, what have you. This is faster, this is cheaper, because a cross-sectional study you can do at a single point in time. Just taking a slice in time, that's all you're looking to do. But remember that then you have to deal with cohort effects. So people who are, 10 versus 20, 30, 40, etc., they are different from each other in a number of ways. So people that lived through the Cold War may have had this sense that you press the wrong button and you'll destroy something, I can't play with the remote if I don't know what I'm doing, or I'm not going to touch anything on the computer, you just show me how to do it, that sort of thing. You see these wars kind of go on with, references to baby boomers versus Gen X, millennials, that sort of thing. But there are differences in history. So when I see you guys and your childhood, I never grew up during a pandemic. I can't relate to that. I'm in it right now with you, but I'm not in it while I'm in high school. I also didn't have access to the internet. We used to have to go to the library to do research. We used to have encyclopedias in our homes. We didn't have cell phones. We weren't taking pictures of everything. So there are different pressures, different expectations, different things that we notice. And that does tend to be a problem in cross-sectional studies. But with Terman, he was doing a longitudinal study, and the termites were those people that he included. And now we have emotional intelligence, which is also a construct, so it depends on how you define it. This first called social intelligence, so this ability to perceive, express, understand, and regulate your emotions. Some studies show that emotional intelligence, or your EQ, is a greater predictor for future success than your IQ, or your intelligence quotient. So someone with a strong emotional intelligence or emotional quotient, a strong EQ, would be able to quickly reduce stress when necessary. They'd be able to manage their emotions, pick up more on nonverbal cues, and connect with others using nonverbal communication. Someone with a higher EQ would pick up on those facial expressions, body language sort of things, go out of their way maybe to make people feel more included. And it differs in other areas too. Like some people are really good at being social and not really good at knowing that they've lost their audience, I suppose. And lastly, the brain and intelligence. So does a bigger brain mean greater intelligence? So there is a small correlation, head size and intelligence scores. This is relative to body size. And this is not like, oh, you have a bigger head, so therefore you're smarter. It doesn't work like that. It really works when you're comparing across species, so one type of animal to another type of animal. The larger the brain is in comparison to the body size, it sort of indicates the relative intelligence of the animals in the animal world. And even then, the correlation is super small, 0.15. Einstein gets brought up, really, right, as a prototype for intelligence very frequently, and his brain was apparently no larger than the brain of others. In fact, in some areas it was smaller than others. However, his brain was 15% bigger in the lower region of the parietal lobe, where you'd been looking at sensation, perception, integrating senses, language, spatial intelligence, that sort of thing. But most research puts emphasis on brain functioning, not brain size. And so a faster brain is typically viewed as more intelligent because faster response time is associated with higher intelligence, but it's not the only factor. I'll explain skip sequence to you at a point. And then the question really, does a smarter brain work harder? Well, researchers have found that the areas in the brain that are used for problem solving show less activity in people of high intelligence. So they're using really less glucose, less energy. Intelligent brains work smarter and more efficiently. But when a problem comes up, they may activate more areas because they're priming more connections.